So I want to talk about desire today. And I think that desire is a very touchy topic because, generally speaking, we live in a very permissive society. Not all around the world, but certainly here in the United States. We live in a society where we like our freedoms. We consider it a right to have our freedoms. But desire can be problematic, and so I want to take a look at that. And I want to sort of start the conversation by making sure that we understand that I'm not saying that desire is wrong. And I think that sometimes when we look at things and we talk about things like desire, that there's this implied sort of criticism of it. That's not what we're doing here at all. The goal of a path in self-awareness, in spirituality, is to become simply aware of things. I think it's helpful, as always, to describe the structure of these efforts of the self, because if you hear a description of the structure, then possibly it may make it easier for you to become aware of it. So the structure, I think, is fairly simple. Desire is largely based on pictures in your minds. And so, to think of a very basic example, you picture a beautiful brand new house. You're in the market. So you picture a beautiful brand new house in your head. Now, this may not be a house you're aware of. It may just be sort of a conglomeration of other houses you've seen in the past. But you picture a beautiful house. And when you picture that in your mind, desire starts to crop up, right? So it's really a combination of a picture and an inner effort. And that's how I see most activity of the self, is the combination of a thought and an effort. And that effort is palpable. That effort is a physiologic feeling, I guess you could call it. It is a visceral activity of your body. And that can be helpful when you're trying to look into yourself and trying to discover aspects of what you are, is the fact that although part of the makeup of those efforts is thought-based, whether it be words or pictures that your mind creates, but there also is this energy, this effort to it. So that's really it in a nutshell. I mean, it's not very complicated. Picture, want, right? Now, desire can exist in time. And don't be discouraged or confused about the concept of time. It's very easy. Time is, from your mind standpoint, everything before now, right now, and everything that you think about the future, right? So, future, the idea of buying a new house. Past, last night I had a bowl of ice cream. It was delicious. I think about that. I create a picture in my head about me eating that ice cream. And then from that picture, desire stirs. So you have past, future. The present is similar to both. You know, you see a woman, beautiful woman, walking down the street, and you have a desire for that person. And you know, sometimes the present can be a little tricky in my experience, because sometimes it seems like the image is the actual present. And so just like you're imagining the ice cream from yesterday, you're not imagining something today, you're actually looking at it. That's the image. And you respond to that image with desire directly. But other times, it seems like you see a woman walking down the street, and then desire stirs not because you're directly looking at that person, but because, let's say, for example, you imagine having dinner with them. And so that picture in your mind creates the desire. I think it might be able to go either way. But in general, it's a combination of thought, which in the instances at least I've described here are picture-based thoughts, and then that stirring of desire. So that's very simple in my mind, and I hope I've kept that as simple as possible. Picture, want. And so where does this become a challenge? This becomes a challenge because this isn't the end of the story, right? I mean, if that were the end of the story, it would be a little simpler. But the fact of the matter is we don't just have desire. We respond to those desires in various ways. And so, whereas desire is one effort of self, those responses to desire are another effort of the self. So, for example, let's go back to ice cream. It's a favorite topic and a favorite food. You know, you have a bowl of ice cream. The next day you remember that you had that ice cream, creates some desire, you go and have some more. So let's say you keep doing that for 6 months. And then you develop diabetes. And then you develop heart disease. You decide that, you know, I can't just keep doing whatever I want here because I'm going to hurt myself. And that's a very reasonable thing to think. So you decide that ice cream is bad for me. So you've created now an opinion, a belief about your desire. So that's a very common way that I think that we address something like desire, is we create an opinion like, it's wrong to eat ice cream every day. I shouldn't eat ice cream every day. Now, if you consider the initial desire as a primary effort of the self, then the ways that we address this desire can be considered a secondary effort of the self. And I think a lot of these secondary efforts are very word-based. I might be wrong, it might be different for you. But when I become aware of the ways in which I address desire, there seems to be a combination of words. I shouldn't eat ice cream every day, it's really bad for me. And a similar type of effort. Now that effort is that feeling of wrong, of control. And so, just like in those primary efforts of the self, the secondary efforts also have a combination of words, possibly pictures, and an energy to them. And so, all of that is occurring. And, you know, if the secondary efforts are in contradiction to the primary efforts, then you've set up an internal conflict. And that's what internal conflict is. Conflict is something against something else. And the more you look into this, you may find that a lot of your secondary efforts are in conflict with your primary efforts. And that's a very amazing thing if you can become really honestly, actually aware of how you fight with yourself inside. So, unfortunately, the activity, that secondary activity, can become voluminous. You know, you have a desire for something, and then your opinions and justifications, your analysis, all of that, it can become a huge world. And that's what makes desire so complicated. Not the desire itself, but how we address it. So, can we become aware of how we address our desires? Passively, without any further action. And if we can do that, if we can see ourselves doing that, then that activity can die down. And every time we see that, we catch it a little earlier and a little earlier and a little earlier, until at a certain point, you have the desire, that energy is there, then you just start to address that desire, but you become immediately aware of that, passively, without any other further action. And then it's just a blip on the screen. And that blip on the screen may not go away for a while. I mean, you've been thinking in this pattern a majority of your life. So, however, when that activity dies down, then you really start to see desire. You really start to see those primary processes directly. And that's an amazing thing to be able to do, is to be able to directly see and basically become aware of what you are, what you're made of. And similarly to how the awareness of those secondary processes led to its resolution, perhaps becoming aware directly of your desires can lead to a lessening, a emptying out of the efforts that go into desire. So one of the possible questions that can arise about this is, don't I need to have desire in my life? Would I do anything? Would I become a total sloth? And I think that probably more often than not, those sorts of questions come as fears, justifications, all within the context of this concept of desire. And I think it's important to become aware of those justifications. I need to have desire. If I don't have desire, I wouldn't go to work. So, once again, we use that justification, and yet we're still left with desire. So, if you're happy with your life as it stands, that's great. But if you want to try to live a different kind of life, then you need to become aware of how you justify the way you are and see how that is actually hindering your ability to dive deeper into this type of work. When I really took desire seriously, it's very clear in my mind where I was and what I was thinking. And I was concerned, what kind of life would I live without desire? Would I never do anything that made me happy? I mean, would I be some kind of monk who deprived myself of everything? And I think that that's a very common criticism or fear or justification for desire. And yet at the same time, I saw how desire was creating a lot of sorrow in my life, how continually wanting something made me unhappy. it's great to want something if you can get it fairly easily, like some ice cream. It's less great to want things that are more difficult to get, like the corner office, the mansion, the Porsche. So I could see this sort of appeal to not desiring, but I was concerned about what that life would be like. And so I kind of made a deal with myself. I said, you know what? Let me just look at this for 6 months. Let me just do a trial run. And I'm going to put aside most of those things. Not even going to question whether or not to do these things. What I really want to do is just become as aware as possible about the desires in my life and see what happens. And I think, giving yourself that opportunity to look into this, saying to yourself, I have no idea what living without desire in my life would be like. Admitting that to yourself. That's a heck of a start. So it's not about eating the ice cream or not eating the ice cream. You want to eat the ice cream? Eat the ice cream. What it's about is the psychological warfare, literally psychological warfare, that surrounds that behavior. The desire for the ice cream, to eat it. The frustration if the store is closed. The happiness and pleasure you feel from eating the ice cream. And maybe the regret that you feel because you ate the ice cream and it's not terribly healthy. But the activity itself, the actual eating of the ice cream, is probably the most straightforward part of that whole event. Just to limit your ice cream intake without becoming aware of all these surrounding psychological issues is kind of missing the point. Have a good one.